I discovered my girlfriend has been pretending to be allergic to my cologne, so I'd stop wearing it. Her ex wore the same scent. I found the receipt wedged behind the bathroom mirror when I was fixing the loose frame. $347 at Nordstrom, dated 3 weeks ago, for the exact cologne she'd been allergic to for 8 months. The same bottle I'd thrown away because watching her reaction made me feel like I was poisoning her. My hands went cold, holding that slip of paper, because the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. It was hers. And the billing address? An apartment I'd never heard of, in a neighborhood she claimed to never visit because of bad memories. That's when I knew why the sneezing, the watery eyes, the desperate gasps for air whenever I wore terre d'hermès. All of it had been performance art. But the real question burning through my skull wasn't why she'd lied. It was who she'd bought it for, and why his comfort mattered more than mine. I'd been with Vanessa for 2 years when the allergy first appeared. We met at a corporate law conference in Denver. I was presenting on contract litigation. She was there representing a pharmaceutical client. She had this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room, leaning forward with her chin on her hand, asking questions that proved she'd actually absorbed every word. We exchanged numbers, started texting, and within 3 months, she'd relocated to Seattle for a promotion that conveniently placed her 15 minutes from my apartment. The first year was textbook perfect. She loved my taste in music, tolerated my obsession with home-brewing beer, even pretended to enjoy the Mariners games I dragged her to. I proposed on our 1-year anniversary at Cary Park, downtown skyline glittering behind us. She cried, said yes, and for a moment, I believed I'd gotten lucky beyond what I deserved. The cologne incident started innocuously enough, just a casual comment after I'd bought a new bottle of terre d'hermès in February. "Is that new?" she asked, wrinkling her nose slightly as I came out of the bathroom. I told her I'd picked it up because my old standby had been discontinued, and she nodded, saying nothing more. But over the next week, I noticed her keeping distance when we'd normally be close, standing at the far end of the kitchen counter instead of hip to hip while cooking, sitting at opposite ends of the couch during movie nights. When I asked if something was wrong, she hesitated, then admitted she thought she might be developing a sensitivity to fragrances. "Probably just seasonal allergies kicking in early," she said, flashing that apologetic smile I'd learned to trust. "You know how Seattle springs mess with everyone." I suggested she take some Claritin, and she agreed, but her reactions only intensified. By March, she was having full theatrical episodes whenever I wore it. Eyes streaming, violent sneezing fits, clutching her throat like she couldn't breathe. I'd rush to open windows, strip off my shirt, feel like absolute garbage for causing her distress. She never directly asked me to stop wearing it, which I respected. She'd just suffer through it, insisting she didn't want to control my choices. That made me feel worse, obviously, so I stopped wearing it altogether. Threw the bottle away, switched back to an older cologne from my college days that smelled like generic department store ambition. She seemed relieved, but didn't acknowledge it, which I interpreted as her being gracious about my sacrifice. I told myself it was a small price for her comfort, that relationships were about compromise. My best friend Danny said I was being trained like a Pavlovian dog, but I brushed him off. He'd been divorced twice. What did he know about making things work? The first crack in the performance appeared in late April when I stopped by her office unannounced to surprise her with lunch. Her assistant Jeremy was at his desk, and I immediately noticed the scent. Woody, citrus, unmistakably terre d'hermès. "Great cologne," I said automatically, more to make conversation than anything else. He grinned, thanking me, said his girlfriend had excellent taste in gifts. I thought nothing of it until I walked into Vanessa's office and watched her face cycle through surprise, confusion, then something I couldn't quite name before settling on her usual warmth. She hugged me, thanked me for the sandwich, but kept the door wide open the entire time I was there. Unusual for someone who normally closed it for privacy during lunch. I noticed she wasn't sneezing or showing any signs of distress, despite Jeremy's cologne obviously permeating the office suite. When I mentioned this on the drive home, she explained she'd started taking a new antihistamine that was finally working. I wanted to ask why she hadn't mentioned this breakthrough, but she changed the subject to weekend plans, and I let it drop. The second crack appeared when I was doing laundry in May and found a men's dress shirt mixed in with her dry cleaning. Navy blue, size large, definitely not mine. I wore medium. When I asked about it, she barely glanced up from her laptop. "Oh, that's probably Jeremy's from the conference last month. We had to share a rental car, and he threw his jacket in my suitcase by accident. Just toss it in a bag and I'll return it Monday." The explanation was reasonable enough, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed, like she'd been prepared for this exact question. I held up the shirt, noticing it had been professionally cleaned and pressed, which seemed like a lot of effort for someone else's mistake. "Why'd you get it dry cleaned?" I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me, with this expression that was half amusement and half something sharper. "Because I'm not a savage, Carter. I'm not returning someone's clothing dirty." The way she said my name, how like I was being unreasonable, made me feel foolish for asking. I put the shirt in a bag and forgot about it. The receipt changed everything. I found it on a Sunday morning in June while she was at her mother's house in Tacoma, supposedly helping clean out the garage. The bathroom mirror had been loose for weeks, driving me crazy every time I opened it and watched it tilt at wrong angles. I finally decided to fix it properly, removing it from the wall to tighten the mounting brackets. That's when the receipt fluttered out from behind it, like it had been deliberately hidden in the gap between mirror and wall. At first, I thought it was just random trash that had slipped back there, but the date caught my eye. May 18th, 3 weeks ago. The item list was clear. 1 bottle of Terra d'Hermes, 100 milliliters, $347 with tax. The signature was Vanessa's usual looping scrawl. The billing address was 4420 Roosevelt Way, NE, Unit 12B. I stood there in my bathroom, holding this receipt, feeling my entire understanding of reality tilt sideways. She'd bought the cologne she was supposedly allergic to. She'd bought it recently. She'd bought it and had it shipped somewhere that wasn't our shared apartment. I did what any person would do in that moment. I got in my car and drove to Roosevelt Way. The building was a mid-rise from the 1970s, the kind of place that probably looked modern once, but now just looked tired, with a dated brick facade and narrow balconies crowded with dead plants and storage bins. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, trying to talk myself out of what I was about to do. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she'd bought it as a gift for a colleague. Maybe the address was a mistake. But I couldn't shake the image of her theatrical choking fits, the way she'd made me feel like I was slowly killing her with my choice of fragrance. I got out of the car and walked to the building directory in the lobby. Unit 12B was listed under the name D. Thornton. I didn't recognize the name, but I also didn't know most of Vanessa's colleagues outside her immediate team. I stood there for another 10 minutes, debating whether to buzz the apartment, when the decision was made for me. The elevator doors opened and a man walked out. Tall, probably 6'2", athletic build, wearing running gear and a light sheen of sweat. He was maybe 35, with the kind of angular jaw and professionally maintained stubble that belonged in cologne advertisements. As he passed me heading for the exit, I caught the scent. Terre d'Hermes, unmistakable, the exact woody citrus notes that had apparently been suffocating my fiancé for months. I stood frozen as he jogged past, then turned and called after him. "Excuse me, do you live in 12B? He stopped, pulled out an earbud, looked at me with polite confusion. "Yeah, why?" I should have had a cover story prepared, but my brain was moving through mud. "I'm supposed to deliver a package there, but the name doesn't match, Is there a Vanessa at that address?" His expression shifted, something unreadable crossing his face. "Vanessa? No, it's just me. You probably have the wrong unit." He put his earbud back in before I could respond and jogged out the door. I watched him disappear down the street, my pulse hammering in my ears, trying to piece together what I'd just learned. She'd bought cologne and sent it to a man's apartment, a man who wore the scent she claimed was killing her. I went home and searched through Vanessa's things with methodical precision, hating myself for it but unable to stop. Her laptop was password protected, but her iPad was still logged into her iCloud account. I opened her email and searched for Thornton. 37 results. The most recent was from 4 days ago, a dinner reservation confirmation at Canlis, one of the most expensive restaurants in Seattle. For 2 people at 8 o'clock on a night Vanessa had told me she was attending a pharmaceutical industry dinner. I scrolled through the thread, watching months of correspondence unfold in reverse chronology. Lunch meetups, inside jokes, pet names, V&D, and references to our place that clearly meant the Roosevelt Way apartment. One email from March included a photo attachment. I almost didn't open it, some part of me still wanting to preserve plausible deniability, but my hand clicked it before my brain could intervene. It was a photo of the two of them in what looked like the apartment. She was sitting in his lap on a leather couch I didn't recognize, both of them laughing at something off camera. She was wearing my grandmother's necklace, the one I'd given her for our first anniversary. The metadata showed it was taken on a Thursday afternoon when she'd told me she was in Portland for a client meeting. I called Danny. He picked up on the first ring, heard something in my voice, and told me to come over immediately. I drove to his place in Fremont in a daze, running red lights without noticing, arriving at his apartment building with no memory of the route I'd taken. He met me at the door with a beer already open, took one look at my face and steered me to his couch. I told him everything, the receipt, the apartment, the emails, the photo. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you known Vanessa?" he finally asked. 2 years, I said. "And how long have you actually known Vanessa?" he repeated, emphasizing the word differently. I realized I didn't have an answer. The woman I thought I knew didn't exist. The woman I'd proposed to was a performance, carefully calibrated to my preferences, designed to make me compliant. "You need a lawyer," Danny said, "and probably a therapist. But first, you need documentation. Everything you found, or screenshot it, save it, back it up. Then you need to decide what you want out of this." What I wanted was answers, but I was terrified of getting them. I went back home before Vanessa returned from Tacoma, spent 2 hours methodically documenting everything: screenshots of emails, photos of the receipt, a recording of the building directory showing 12B registered to D. Thornton. I uploaded everything to a private cloud folder and emailed the link to Danny with instructions to save it if I somehow, accidentally, deleted it. Then I sat on the couch and waited, rehearsing confrontation scripts in my head that all sounded either too aggressive or too pathetic. When her car pulled into the parking lot at 7:30, I felt my chest tighten with anxiety. She came through the door looking tired, hair pulled back in a messy bun, carrying a bag of what smelled like Thai takeout. "Hey babe, brought dinner," she called, heading to the kitchen. "How was your day?" I stood up, my prepared speech evaporating instantly. "Who's D. Thornton?" I asked, my voice coming out flat. She froze mid-step, her back still to me, and I watched her shoulders tense. "What?" she said, still not turning around. "Who is D. Thornton, and why did you buy him cologne?" She turned slowly, her face a perfect mask of confusion. "Carter, what are you talking about?" The performance was flawless. I almost believed her myself. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshot of the receipt. "I found this behind the bathroom mirror. You bought Terra d'Hermes 3 weeks ago and had it sent to an apartment on Roosevelt Way. So I'll ask again, who is D. Thornton?" She stared at the phone screen, and I watched her brain work through possible explanations at visible speed. She landed on righteous indignation. "You went through my things? You drove to some random address and what? Stalked the building? Jesus, Carter, this is insane." I kept my voice level. "I fixed the bathroom mirror and the receipt fell out. And yes, I drove there. I also checked your email, saw the photos, read the messages. So we can do this the easy way where you tell me the truth, or we can do this the hard way where I show you every piece of evidence I have. Your choice." Her mask cracked. Not much, just a flicker of calculation behind her eyes. But enough. She set the takeout bag down carefully on the counter. "His name is Derek Thornton. And yeah, we've been seeing each other." The confirmation should have hurt more, but I'd already processed the betrayal during my drive to Danny's. What I needed now was the why. "How long?" I asked. She looked at me, seemed to weigh her options, then apparently decided honesty was easier than maintaining the lie. "Since before I moved to Seattle. We met at the same conference where I met you. He was presenting on pharmaceutical patents. We dated for about 8 months, broke up when I took the job here, but stayed in touch. When things between us got serious," she gestured between us, "I realized I'd made a mistake. So I reached out to Derek, and he moved to Seattle 6 months ago." I felt my legs go weak and sat down hard on the couch. 6 months ago. That's when the allergy started. She had the decency to look embarrassed. "He wears Terra d'Hermes. Always has. It was his signature scent when we dated. When you started wearing it, all I could think about was him. It felt wrong having you smell like him, so I improvised." The word improvised hit me like a slap. She'd gaslighted me for months, made me feel guilty for wearing cologne, all because it reminded her of the man she was cheating with. "The Roosevelt apartment? Is that where you've been going? All those late nights at the office, those client dinners, the Portland trips?" She nodded slowly. "Derek signed the lease in January. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we figured things out, but..." She trailed off, and I finished the thought for her. "But you couldn't decide which life you wanted, so you kept both." She didn't deny it. "I do love you, Carter. That part was real. But Derek and I have history, and when he moved here, I couldn't just ignore that. I thought I could figure it out, but it got complicated." I laughed, a harsh bark of sound that didn't feel like it came from me. "Complicated? You faked a medical condition, manipulated me into changing my behavior, lied about your whereabouts for months, and you call it complicated?" She flinched. "I know how it sounds. I know I screwed up. But I didn't know how to have this conversation without destroying everything." I stood up, grabbed my keys off the coffee table. "Consider it destroyed," I said, and walked out before she could respond. I heard her calling my name as I got in my car, but I was already backing out of the space, heading to Danny's place because I had nowhere else to go. I spent that night on Danny's couch, staring at his ceiling, replaying 2 years of my life and wondering how much of it had been real. The next morning, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Amanda Grayson, a family law specialist Danny's brother had used during his divorce. She could see me that afternoon, so I spent the morning organizing my documentation into a coherent timeline. When I arrived at her office in downtown Seattle, she was exactly what I needed. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variation of human betrayal and wasn't impressed by any of it. I walked her through everything: the fake allergy, the receipt, the apartment, the emails, the confession. She took notes on a legal pad, asking occasional clarifying questions, her expression never changing. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "First question. Are you married or just engaged?" I told her engaged. "Good. That makes this cleaner." "Second question. Any joint assets? Shared accounts? Property? Debts?" I told her we'd kept our finances separate. Smart move in retrospect, though we'd just started looking at houses together. She nodded. "Third question. What do you want out of this?" I hadn't really thought about what I wanted beyond just confirming I wasn't crazy. I don't know, acknowledgement? I want her to understand what she did. Amanda's expression softened slightly. "Carter, I'm going to be honest with you. You're not going to get the closure you're looking for from her. People who are capable of this level of deception don't suddenly develop insight and remorse because you call them on it. But what you can do is protect yourself and make sure she can't do more damage. She outlined my options: officially end the engagement, retrieve any property from the shared apartment, document everything for potential future legal needs even though we weren't married, consider whether I wanted to inform her employer given the affair potentially involved a work contact. That last part caught my attention. What do you mean, inform her employer? Amanda leaned back in her chair. You said she met both you and this Derek at a corporate law conference related to her pharmaceutical work. If she's been conducting an affair that involves work travel, company resources, or misrepresentation of her whereabouts during work hours, that's potentially an ethics issue. I'm not saying you should do it out of revenge. I'm saying you should understand all the leverage you have. I left Amanda's office with a clear action plan and a retainer agreement I'd signed for her to represent me in officially dissolving the engagement and handling any disputes over the ring or shared property. She'd advised me to return to the apartment with a witness, collect my essential items, and establish temporary residence elsewhere while we sorted things out formally. Danny agreed to come with me that evening, and we arrived at the apartment around 6 o'clock. Vanessa was there, looking like she'd been crying, makeup smeared, still wearing yesterday's clothes. She started to speak when I walked in, but I held up a hand. I'm here to get some clothes and my laptop. Danny's here as a witness. I'm staying elsewhere until we figure out next steps. She looked at Danny with obvious resentment, then back at me. Carter, please, can we talk about this? I know I messed up, but we can work through it. Couples therapy, whatever you need, I cut her off. Vanessa, you maintained a parallel relationship for months. You gaslit me about a medical condition that doesn't exist. You lied about your location, your schedule, your feelings. There's no working through that. There's just accepting it happened and moving forward separately. She followed me to the bedroom, watching as I packed a duffel bag with clothes and toiletries. What about the ring? She asked quietly. I stopped packing and turned to look at her. What about it? She twisted it on her finger. My grandmother's engagement ring, an Art Deco platinum setting with a center diamond surrounded by sapphires. I'd proposed with it specifically because it was a family heirloom, a connection to my past I'd wanted to share with my future. Do you want it back? She asked. I held out my hand without speaking. She hesitated, and I saw her calculating whether refusing would give her some kind of leverage. She must have decided against it, because she slowly pulled it off and placed it in my palm. The metal was warm from her skin. I put it in my pocket and went back to packing. Danny stood in the doorway, arms crossed, projecting silent judgment that was somehow more effective than any words. As I zipped my duffel, Vanessa made one last attempt. I never meant to hurt you. I couldn't choose. And the longer it went on, the harder it got to stop. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to find the woman I thought I was going to marry. She wasn't there. Maybe she never had been. The thing is, Vanessa, you did choose. Every time you went to that apartment, every time you lied about where you were, every time you made me feel guilty about cologne, you chose. You just wanted to avoid the consequences of choosing. Over the next week, I moved into a temporary furnished apartment in Capitol Hill while I figured out my long-term plans. I'd been living with Vanessa for a year, and before that I'd had roommates, so being completely alone in a space was disorienting. Danny checked in daily, bringing food and occasionally just sitting in silence while I processed everything. I started seeing the therapist Amanda had recommended, Dr. Rebecca Nguyen, who specialized in betrayal trauma and relationship recovery. She was in her 50s, with a calm presence that made her office feel like a refuge from the chaos in my head. Our first session, she had me walk through the timeline again, but this time focusing on my emotional experience rather than the facts. You mentioned feeling guilty about the cologne, she said at one point. Can you talk more about that? I explained how I'd felt responsible for Vanessa's suffering, how I'd immediately stopped wearing it without her even asking, how I'd internalized the idea that my preferences mattered less than her comfort. Dr. Nguyen nodded slowly. That's a classic manipulation tactic called covert control. She didn't have to directly ask you to stop she created conditions where stopping felt like your idea, your choice, your responsibility. That way, she gets what she wants while maintaining the appearance of being reasonable and accommodating. The insight hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent 2 years congratulating myself on being a considerate partner, on prioritizing Vanessa's needs, on being the kind of man who didn't let ego get in the way of compromise. But what I'd actually been doing was responding to manipulation so subtle, I'd mistaken it for love. Dr. Nguyen gave me homework make a list of every time I'd change my behavior or preferences to accommodate Vanessa, then evaluate whether those changes came from genuine compromise or from manufactured guilt. I spent that night working on the list, and it grew longer than I'd anticipated. I'd stopped wearing the cologne. I'd changed my gym schedule because she said she felt lonely when I worked out before work, instead of after. I'd cut back on time with Danny because she'd mentioned feeling excluded from my friendships. I'd stopped brewing beer because she'd casually mentioned the smell bothered her. I'd switched from Android to iPhone because she said it would be easier to stay connected with compatible devices. None of these things had seemed significant individually, but seeing them compiled into a single document made the pattern impossible to ignore. I'd been systematically trained to prioritize her comfort over my own autonomy, and I'd done it willingly, thinking it made me a good partner. My breaking point came 2 weeks after moving out, when I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Carter Brennan?" a male voice asked. I confirmed it was. "My name is Felix Hartlia. I'm a private investigator working on a case that involves your ex-fiancée, CE, Vanessa Keene. Do you have time to meet?" I immediately thought this was some kind of scam, but Felix gave me his license number and the name of the law firm that had hired him, Davis and Portman, one of the major corporate firms in Seattle. I agreed to meet him the next day at a coffee shop in Belltown. He was older than I expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent decades observing human nature at its worst. He showed me his credentials, then pulled out a tablet. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to show you some information, and I need you to tell me if any of it is familiar." He pulled up a photo, Vanessa and Derek at a restaurant I didn't recognize. "That's Derek Thornton, right? The guy from Roosevelt Way?" I asked. Felix nodded. "That's him. What you probably don't know is that Derek Thornton is actually Derek Chen, and he's currently under investigation for pharmaceutical patent fraud." The name hit me like cold water. Chen. Derek Chen. I'd seen that name before in Vanessa's work emails, but always in the context of opposing counsel or competing firms. What does this have to do with Vanessa? Felix pulled up another document or email chains between Vanessa and Derek, discussing drug trial data, patent applications, and FDA approval timelines for medications her client was developing. "We believe your ex-fiancé, CE, has been feeding confidential client information to Mr. Chen for at least 18 months. He's been using that information to file competing patents and sell advanced knowledge to pharmaceutical companies looking to get ahead of market releases. We're talking about potential damages in the range of $40 to $70 million. I felt my stomach drop. "You think she's been committing corporate espionage?" Felix's expression was sympathetic but firm. "We don't think, we know. We have electronic evidence, financial records showing payments from shell companies Chen controls to accounts in Vanessa's name, testimony from witnesses who've seen them together discussing proprietary information. What we don't have is full context about their relationship, and that's where you come in." I spent the next 3 hours in that coffee shop telling Felix everything I knew, the timeline of Vanessa's move to Seattle, the progression of our relationship, the fake allergy, the Roosevelt apartment, the emails I'd found. He recorded everything with my permission, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions about dates or specific incidents. When I mentioned the cologne manipulation, he actually laughed, not cruelly, but with the recognition of someone who'd seen similar patterns before. "The cologne thing is actually brilliant from a tactical standpoint," he said. "She needed you compliant and focused on her needs, not paying attention to her schedule or behavior. Creating a fake medical crisis that you could solve by changing your behavior accomplished multiple goals. It established her as vulnerable, and you as protective. It gave her control over a seemingly minor aspect of your life, which opened the door to larger control, and it kept you from wearing a scent that would remind her she was juggling 2 relationships. That's sophisticated manipulation." Hearing it broken down so clinically made me feel simultaneously validated and stupid. I'd been played by a professional, someone who understood how to exploit basic human decency for criminal purposes. Felix explained that the prosecution was building a case against both Vanessa and Derek, but they needed witnesses who could speak to the broader pattern of deception. "You're not a material witness to the corporate espionage itself," he said, "but you can establish her character and pattern of behavior. Juries like context. They want to understand not just what someone did, but who they are. If we can show that Vanessa is someone who maintained elaborate deceptions in her personal life, it helps establish that she's capable of the same in her professional life." He asked if I'd be willing to provide a formal statement and potentially testify if the case went to trial. I said yes without hesitation, though part of me wondered if I was motivated by justice or revenge. Felix must have sensed my internal conflict because he leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Mr. Brennan, I've been doing this for 32 years, and I've learned to spot the difference between people who want revenge and people who want accountability. You're the latter. What happened to you matters, not just because it hurt you, but because it's evidence of a larger pattern. You helping this case isn't about getting back at her. It's about preventing her from doing this to someone else." I provided my formal statement to the prosecutors the following week. 2 assistant district attorneys named Jennifer Kwan and David Stromberg, both in their 30s, both projecting the kind of intense focus that suggested they lived and breathed their cases. They walked me through my testimony, asked about specific dates and communications, showed me evidence I hadn't seen before, bank records showing Vanessa had received over $200,000 in payments over 18 months, surveillance photos of her and Derek meeting in parking garages and hotel bars, recorded phone calls where she discussed client information she had no legitimate reason to know. "Did she ever mention having financial stress or needing money?" Jennifer asked. I thought about it. No, she always seemed comfortable. She'd occasionally mention expensive dinners or shopping trips, but nothing that seemed beyond her salary range. She made good money as a pharmaceutical rep. David made a note. "That's consistent with what we've seen. The payments weren't going to obvious expenses. They were being saved or invested. This wasn't about need, it was about greed. That distinction mattered to me more than I'd expected. I'd been trying to understand what would drive someone to maintain this elaborate double life, and knowing it was simple greed rather than desperation somehow made it worse. The case broke publicly in late July, about 6 weeks after I'd moved out. I woke up to texts from 3 different people sending me links to a Seattle Times article with the headline, "Local Pharmaceutical Rep Charged with Corporate Espionage, Patent Fraud." The article included a photo of Vanessa being led into federal court in handcuffs, her lawyer beside her, her face carefully blank. The details were all there: the scheme, the payments, Derek's previous fraud convictions under different names, the estimated damages to Vanessa's client company. There was a quote from the company's CEO expressing betrayal and disappointment, and a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office promising aggressive prosecution. My phone rang constantly that morning, reporters wanting comments, former mutual friends expressing shock and asking if I'd known, my mother calling in tears because she'd seen the news and couldn't believe that lovely girl had turned out to be a criminal. I didn't answer most of the calls, but I did call Danny. He picked up immediately. "You seeing this?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm seeing it. How you feeling?" I took a moment to check in with myself. "Validated," I finally said, and weirdly calm. Like, this isn't just about me anymore. This is confirmation that my instincts weren't wrong. The preliminary hearings happened throughout August, and I was called to testify in late September. The courthouse was downtown, a gray concrete building that smelled like old paper and anxiety. Jennifer and David met me beforehand to prepare, walking me through likely questions from the defense attorney. "They're going to try to paint you as a bitter ex with an axe to grind," Jennifer warned. "Stay calm, stick to facts, don't engage with emotional manipulation. You're not on trial here, I'll just tell your story truthfully." I took the stand mid-afternoon, swore the oath, and looked out at a courtroom that included Vanessa sitting at the defense table. She looked different, thinner, paler, her hair pulled back severely, wearing a conservative navy suit that was probably chosen to make her look sympathetic. She didn't look at me once. The prosecutor's questions were straightforward. How long had we dated? When did the allergy claims start? What did I observe about her schedule? How did I discover the affair in the Roosevelt apartment? I answered each question carefully, focusing on specific facts and dates, avoiding editorial commentary. Then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. His name was Thomas Berkeley, and he had the kind of calculated charm that probably worked well on juries. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you were angry when you discovered Ms. Keene's infidelity?" he began. "Yes," I said. "Most people would be." He smiled slightly. "And isn't it true that you went through her private emails and documents without her permission?" "Yes," I said again. "After I found evidence of infidelity and deception, I sought to understand the full scope of the situation." He paced in front of the witness box. "So you violated her privacy, drove to a residence where you had no business being, confronted a man you didn't know, and then collected what you considered evidence of wrongdoing. That sounds like stalking, Mr. Brennan." I took a breath, remembered Jennifer's advice. "I discovered my fiancé had been lying to me for months about a medical condition, found a receipt proving she'd purchased the item she claimed to be allergic to, and sent it to another man's address, and sought to verify what that meant. Once I confirmed she'd been conducting an affair, I documented evidence for my own protection. I don't consider that stalking. I consider that due diligence." Thomas shifted tactics. "You mentioned she made good money as a pharmaceutical rep. Were you resentful of her financial success?" I saw where he was going, trying to paint me as someone who'd weaponized the legal system out of jealousy. "No," I said flatly. "I'm a contract attorney. I also make good money. Her income was never a source of tension in our relationship." He raised an eyebrow. "But you did live together, split expenses, yet kept your finances separate. That suggests a lack of trust, doesn't it?" I felt my patience wearing thin, but kept my voice level. "It suggests we were both financially independent adults who hadn't yet merged our lives completely because we weren't married. That's common practice." Thomas consulted his notes. "You also mentioned hiring a divorce attorney. Excuse me, a family law attorney, almost immediately after discovering the affair. That seems calculated." I looked directly at him. "Mr. Berkeley, I discovered my fiancée had been conducting a months-long affair, lying about her whereabouts, and manipulating me through a fake medical condition. Seeking legal counsel to protect myself and formally dissolve the engagement wasn't calculated. It was sensible. What would you have advised a client in my situation to do?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Jennifer objected on grounds of relevance before he could respond. The judge sustained it, and Thomas moved on to his final line of attack. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you didn't actually witness any corporate espionage? You never saw Ms. Keene share confidential information, never saw her receive payments, never saw her commit any of the crimes she's accused of." "That's correct," I said. "I wasn't privy to her professional activities. I'm here to testify about her pattern of deception in our personal relationship, which the prosecution believes is relevant to understanding her character and capability for the crimes charged." Thomas smiled like he'd scored a point. "So everything you've testified to today, the affair, the cologne, the apartment, None of that actually proves she committed corporate espionage? I met his eyes. No. But it proves she's capable of maintaining elaborate lies over extended periods of time, manipulating people who trust her, and operating with complete disregard for the impact on others. Whether that proves corporate espionage is for the jury to decide. The judge called for a break shortly after, and I stepped down feeling drained but steady. The trial continued through October, with testimony from Derek Chen's former associates, experts on pharmaceutical patent law, forensic accountants who traced the money trail, and Vanessa's former colleagues who described suspicious behavior and missing documents. I wasn't present for most of it. Civilian witnesses are typically excluded from the courtroom except during their own testimony, but Danny kept me updated through news coverage and his lawyer brother's connections to the courthouse. The evidence was apparently overwhelming. Emails where Vanessa explicitly discussed sharing client information, recorded phone calls between her and Derek planning timing of patent applications to maximize profit, bank records showing payments that coincided with specific information exchanges. Derek had already taken a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Vanessa, which the defense tried to use to impeach his credibility, but the documentary evidence spoke for itself. In early November, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 12 counts including conspiracy, wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, and obstruction of justice. Sentencing was scheduled for January. I attended the sentencing hearing, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed to see it through to the end, to close the chapter completely. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial, just lawyers, court staff, a few reporters, and representatives from the pharmaceutical company Vanessa had betrayed. The judge was Olivia Frost, a federal magistrate in her 60s with a reputation for tough but fair sentencing. She listened to arguments from both sides, the prosecution recommending 15 to 20 years based on the severity of financial damage and the calculated nature of the crime, the defense pleading for leniency based on Vanessa's previously clean record and her cooperation during trial. Then Judge Frost asked if Vanessa wanted to make a statement. She stood, her voice barely audible, and read from a prepared text about taking responsibility for her actions and understanding the gravity of her mistakes. It was the performance of remorse, delivered with the same careful calculation she'd brought to everything else. Judge Frost didn't seem impressed. Ms. Keene, the judge began, I've presided over many fraud cases in my career, and what distinguishes yours is the sustained, deliberate nature of the deception. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. This was an 18-month conspiracy that required constant lies, manipulation, and exploitation of multiple people's trust. You didn't just betray your employer. You betrayed your colleagues, your partner, and ultimately yourself. The financial damages are substantial, but the human cost is equally significant. You created an elaborate double life that required you to manipulate everyone around you, and you did it with apparent ease. That suggests a fundamental disconnect between your understanding of right and wrong, and it's the court's responsibility to protect society from that disconnect. She sentenced Vanessa to 12 years in federal prison, with restitution of $43 million to the affected company, and 3 years of supervised release following her sentence. Vanessa showed no visible reaction, just nodded once and sat down. I felt nothing watching her led away, not satisfaction, not relief, just a strange emptiness where all the emotion used to be. I walked out of the courthouse into cold January rain, feeling like I'd emerged from a parallel universe. The past 8 months had been consumed by this case, the discovery, the investigation, the trial, the resolution. And now it was over, and I had to figure out how to move forward. I'd been seeing Dr. Nguyen regularly, working through the betrayal trauma and rebuilding my sense of self. Healing isn't linear, she'd told me in our last session. You're going to have good days and bad days, moments where you feel strong and moments where you feel like you're back at square one. That's normal. What matters is the overall trajectory, not the daily fluctuations. I'd also been slowly reconnecting with friends I'd pulled away from during the relationship, rediscovering interests I'd let fade, rebuilding the life I'd compromised piece by piece. I'd started brewing beer again, bought a new bottle of Terre d'Hermes just to prove I could, joined a recreational soccer league where nobody knew my story or cared about my past. 3 months after the sentencing, I got an unexpected email from Derek Chen's attorney. Derek had written a letter he wanted forwarded to me. Apparently, he wasn't allowed direct contact due to the terms of his plea agreement, but his lawyer could pass along correspondence. I debated whether to read it, asked Dr. Nguyen's opinion, and she suggested that it might provide closure or it might be re-traumatizing, and only I could decide which was more likely. I decided to read it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, and surprisingly thoughtful. Derek explained that he'd been struggling with addiction issues when he'd gotten involved in the fraud scheme, that meeting Vanessa had given him a sense of purpose that he'd confused with love, that he'd watched her manipulate me while knowing he was complicit in that manipulation. I'm not writing this to excuse what I did or to make you feel sorry for me, he wrote. I'm writing because you deserve to know that none of it was your fault. Vanessa was good at finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. She found mine in addiction and isolation. She found yours in decency and trust. You didn't fail to see the signs. She was just skilled at hiding them. The letter continued. I've had a lot of time to think about the cologne thing. And I want you to know it was my signature scent long before I met her. When she told me she'd gotten you to stop wearing it, I actually felt sick. I knew what it meant, that she was controlling you the same way she was controlling me, just through different tactics. I should have said something, should have warned you, but I was too deep in my own mess to care about anyone else's. I'm sorry for that. He went on to explain that he'd been sober for 6 months in prison, was attending therapy, and was trying to understand how he'd become someone capable of causing so much harm. I don't expect forgiveness from you or anyone else, he concluded. I just wanted you to know that you were right to trust your instincts, right to get out, and right to help build the case against us. What happened to you matters, even if it wasn't technically illegal. Manipulation is still abuse, even when it's subtle enough to avoid criminal charges. I hope you're healing, and I hope you've found or will find someone who deserves the kind of trust you're capable of giving. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how I felt about it. On one level, it was self-serving. Derek was trying to rehabilitate his own image, to present himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a willing participant in crime. But on another level, the details felt genuine, particularly his recognition that what Vanessa had done to me constituted abuse, even if it wasn't legally prosecutable. I wrote a brief response through his attorney, not forgiving him but acknowledging the letter, and then filed it away in the folder with all the other evidence of those 8 months. I didn't need to carry his guilt along with my own recovery, but I also didn't need to pretend his words meant nothing. They were just another piece of the story, another perspective on the woman who'd temporarily derailed multiple lives for her own benefit. By summer, a year after the initial discovery, I'd moved into a new apartment in Ballard, a 1-bedroom with exposed brick and big windows that let in actual light. I'd adopted a dog from the shelter, a terrier mix named Murphy, who was terrible at fetch, but excellent at emotional support. I'd gotten promoted at my firm, taking on more complex contracts and mentoring junior attorneys. I'd even gone on a few dates, though nothing serious yet. I was still rebuilding my ability to trust, and that took time. But I was healing, slowly, in the uneven way Dr. Nguyen had described. I still thought about Vanessa sometimes, usually when I encountered something that triggered a memory, a particular song, the scent of someone else's cologne, a news story about corporate fraud. But the thoughts had less power now. They were just thoughts, echoes of a past that no longer defined my present. I ran into Jeremy, Vanessa's former assistant, at a coffee shop in late August. He recognized me immediately and asked if we could talk. We sat outside, and he told me he'd left the pharmaceutical company shortly after Vanessa's arrest, couldn't handle the scrutiny and the constant questions about what he'd known or suspected. I felt like an idiot, he said. I worked right next to her every day, and I never saw it. Or maybe I saw pieces but never put them together. I told him about my experience, how the manipulation had been subtle and progressive, designed to make victims question their own perceptions. That's exactly it, he said, looking relieved to have language for what he'd experienced. She'd asked me to book conference rooms or schedule calls with people I didn't recognize, but she always had reasonable explanations. And I liked her. She was friendly, bought me coffee, remembered my girlfriend's name. I wanted to believe her. We talked for over an hour about gaslighting, about professional betrayal, about the particular shame of being deceived by someone you'd trusted. By the end, we both felt less alone in what we'd experienced. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly in September, almost 15 months after I'd found the receipt. I received a certified letter from the pharmaceutical company Vanessa had betrayed. Inside was a check for $15,000 and a letter from their CEO, Linda Vaughn. Dear Mr. Brennan, it began, our company has been working through the aftermath of Ms. Keene's betrayal, and in that process, we learned about your role in bringing the case to light. While we understand your motivation was personal rather than professional, your willingness to provide testimony and evidence was instrumental in our ability to pursue justice. The attached check is a token of our appreciation, a finder's fee, if you will, for your contribution to exposing fraud that could have continued costing our company millions. We also wanted to extend our apologies for the personal harm Ms. Keene's actions caused you. Corporate espionage often leaves multiple victims in its wake, and we recognize that you were among them. We hope this gesture provides some measure of acknowledgement for what you endured. I stared at the check for a long time, trying to decide what to do with it. It felt strange taking money for something that had caused me so much pain, like profiting from my own trauma. But Dr. Nguyen had a different perspective when I brought it up in our session. This isn't blood money, she said. This is a company acknowledging that you provided value to their investigation and compensating you accordingly. You're allowed to accept that without guilt. In fact, I'd encourage you to think about what receiving that compensation means symbolically. It's external validation that your experience mattered, that your instincts were correct, that your pain had purpose beyond just your personal growth. I thought about what she'd said and decided to donate half to an organization that supported victims of intimate partner manipulation and use the other half to fund a solo trip to Iceland I'd been wanting to take for years. Vanessa and I had talked about going together, but I'd kept postponing it because she never seemed enthusiastic. Now I could go on my own terms, creating new memories untainted by her influence. The Iceland trip in October was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was something about standing at the edge of the North Atlantic, watching waves crash against black sand beaches, that put everything in perspective. My relationship with Vanessa had felt all-consuming while I was in it, but from this distance, geographical and temporal, it was just one chapter in a much longer story. I was 34 years old. I'd survived a spectacular betrayal, helped put a criminal in prison, and emerged with my integrity intact. I'd learned about manipulation tactics, boundary setting, and the difference between compromise and compliance. I'd learned that my instincts were trustworthy, that my kindness wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about integrating the experience into my larger narrative and refusing to let it define me. I returned from Iceland with clarity about what I wanted moving forward. A life built on authenticity rather than performance, relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation, and the confidence to trust my own perception even when it conflicted with what others wanted me to believe. I started writing about my experience, initially just for myself, then eventually sharing parts of it anonymously online in communities for people who'd survived manipulative relationships. The responses were overwhelming. Hundreds of people recognizing their own experiences in my story, finding language for things they'd felt but couldn't articulate, feeling less alone in their confusion and pain. I learned that what Vanessa had done to me had a name, covert narcissistic abuse, and that it followed predictable patterns that therapists and researchers had been documenting for decades. I wasn't special or uniquely gullible. I was just one more person who'd encountered a skilled manipulator and survived. A year and a half after finding the receipt, I was completely settled into my new life. The apartment in Ballard felt like home. Murphy had mastered basic commands and become a neighborhood favorite at the dog park. I'd been promoted again at work and was starting to take on expert witness consulting for other fraud cases. I was dating someone new, a graphic designer named Rachel, who I'd met through mutual friends, who was kind and straightforward, and whose biggest deception was occasionally claiming she'd eaten one cookie when she'd actually eaten 3. We took things slow, both of us coming into the relationship with baggage that required patience and communication. When I told her about Vanessa, not the whole story, just the broad strokes, she listened without judgment and then asked, "What did you learn about yourself?" I thought about it. That I'm resilient, that I can trust myself, and that I deserve relationships where I don't have to constantly question reality. She smiled. "Yeah, you do." I still wear Terre d'Hermès sometimes, though it's no longer my daily scent. I've expanded my rotation to include other fragrances that mark different phases of my life. But when I do wear it, it no longer triggers memories of Vanessa's fake choking or Derek's apartment or the months of deception. Now it just smells like expensive cologne, woody and citrus, the scent of a man who survived manipulation and came out stronger. Sometimes I catch a whiff of it on someone else in an elevator or coffee shop, and instead of anxiety, I feel a quiet satisfaction. She tried to take that from me, tried to make me associate it with guilt and danger, but it's just cologne. She's in federal prison, I'm rebuilding my life, and I get to decide what things mean to me. The last time I thought about Vanessa, really thought about her, beyond passing references or triggering moments, was on a cold evening in December, almost 2 years after I'd found the receipt. I was walking Murphy along the waterfront, watching the ferries cross Puget Sound, and I realized I'd gone an entire week without her crossing my mind. That felt significant, not because forgetting was the goal, but because her absence from my daily thoughts meant she'd lost her power over my emotional landscape. She was just a person who'd done a terrible thing, and I was just a person who'd survived it. The story didn't need a perfect ending or complete closure or some grand revelation. It just needed to be over, and it was. I went home, made dinner, watched Murphy try to catch snowflakes through the window, and felt genuinely content with the life I'd built from the ruins she'd left behind. That, more than any verdict or sentence or apology, was the real victory. Reclaiming my ability to trust, to love, to choose cologne without trauma, to exist in a world where not everything was a manipulation. She'd tried to take that from me, and she'd failed, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.